My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
On the 4th of August 1892, the bodies of wealthy Fall River, Massachusetts residents Abby and Andrew Borden were found brutally murdered in their home on 2nd Street. A bloody and violent crime in which they suffered 19 and 10 blows from a hatchet which smashed their skulls. A crime made even more notable due to the fact that it happened in broad daylight while two women, Andrew's daughter Lizzie Borden and the family maid Bridget Sullivan, were in or around the house at the time. This was a crime almost designed to get people talking and afraid. I mean, the involvement of such a wealthy, well-known and prominent figure as Andrew Borden was enough in and of itself to get tongues wagging not just in Fall River, but all around the Northeast. Combine that with the brutality of the murders and the fact they happened in broad daylight, people would not only be talking about this crime but also fearing for their own safety. If this could happen to Andrew Borden and his wife in broad daylight in their own home, then how safe was anyone? As soon as the news got out then, which it quickly did, the pressure was on the police to solve this crime so as to allay the fears of the residents of Fall River. Yet before I get into the police investigation, first like always, I want to acknowledge the sources that I used for this episode, like Joseph A. Conforti's Lizzie Borden on Trial, Murder, Ethnicity, and Gender, Edward D. Radin's Lizzie Borden The Untold Story, David Kent's 40 Wax New Evidence in the Life and Legend of Lizzie Borden, William L. Masterson's Lizzie Didn't Do It, Arnold R. Brown's Lizzie Borden The Legend, The Truth, The Final Chapter, and Frank Spearing's Lizzie. And like always, a complete list of these sources and any others that I use like websites will be posted on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages. And with all that being said, let's begin. The Fall River police were likely never going to look good as a result of this case. To begin with, they were starting things off with a bit of a black eye, as when this brutal murder of some of the city's wealthier residents was taking place, the police department was having their annual picnic. A situation that, according to the newspapers, meant that half to 3/4 of the department was down by the seashore enjoying the day while the brutal murders of Abby and Andrew Borden were taking place. Now, it's not like the cops could or would have done anything had this been a normal day, but it was a bad look nonetheless, and one that critics of the investigation and their conclusion would use as a mark against them. Yet, despite the fact that this was the day of their annual picnic, there would still be cops on the scene within half an hour of the bodies on 2nd Street being discovered. And for all the criticisms leveled against them, some of it very warranted, the cops did seem to at least attempt to carry out a fairly extensive investigation, which does not necessarily mean it wasn't flawed or that they came to the right conclusion. It's just they did seem to at the very least put in some effort, as they would interview witnesses or supposedly suspicious individuals from Boston, Westport, and New Bedford, Massachusetts, in addition to individuals from Riverton, Portsmouth, Bristol, and Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and they even sent an officer to Albany, New York to check on a potential suspect. That being said, there were still plenty of reasons to be critical. Most importantly, the cops did not bother to rope off the crime scene. As a result, people from all over Fall River who wanted a look at the gory scene that was the talk of the town and a sure topic of gossip for who knows how long, were able to just traipse on through the house and around the property that was very much a crime scene. Indeed, according to the Fall River Herald, quote, "From the moment the story of the crime was first told to long after midnight, 2nd Street was crowded with curious people anxious to hear some particulars that had not been told before. The murders were such big news that it said that multiple mills and factories in town were shut down that day as a result of so many workers leaving at noon to congregate around the crime scene, while the police, especially early on, were just completely unprepared for this situation. As a result, blood from the guest room was tracked around the house, while people just continuously walked through the yard, potentially eliminating any signs that someone who wasn't a member of the household had been around there. Additionally, a number of individuals also went into the Borden's barn, potentially disturbing any evidence that may or may not have supported Lizzie's claims of her being out there during the time when her father was being murdered, which is all to say that things were a mess. Now, the police were initially summoned to the scene as a result of Lizzie asking Mrs. Churchill to find a doctor. Mrs. Churchill, in doing so, then spoke to several people asking them to help her find a physician and to get the police. Overhearing some of this exchange, John Cunningham, who worked as a news dealer on 2nd Street, interpreted what he heard as some kind of fight had taken place over at the Borden residence, and so he took it upon himself to call the police at 11:15 from the nearby paint shop. Importantly, when doing so, the newspaper dealer also looked after his own bottom line, as he made sure to notify both the Fall River Globe and the Evening News about this potentially major news story. Patrolman George Allen, who was new to the force, would then be dispatched to the Borden home to look into the quote-unquote row that had taken place. Upon entering the home and seeing Andrew's body, though, Allen immediately realized that this was a much bigger deal than had originally been assumed, and that he was in way over his head. So he quickly raced back to the station to inform the city marshal. After doing so, Patrolman Allen was dispatched to the scene of the crime with Patrolman Michael Mullally in tow. By the time the true patrolman arrived, though, there was already a reporter from the Globe at the scene. Then, in under half an hour, they would also be joined by several more policemen, a pair of doctors, at least one if not two more reporters, and Reverend Edwin Buck of the Central Congregational Church. The first thing the police did upon arriving was search the house from top to bottom to make sure the culprit was not still hiding and laying in wait somewhere on the premises. Satisfied that there was no one else hiding in the home, the cops began investigating the crime at hand. As they did so, it seems that the focus of the investigation was Andrew, while Abby was almost an afterthought. He was, after all, not only the man of the house, but he was also one of the city's richest and most prominent citizens. As such, he was seen as obviously the primary target. As they started looking into the crime, though, the cops quickly came to the conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the house. Indeed, Andrew still had his silver watch and cheap gold ring on his finger. Theft then was seemingly eliminated as a possible motive for these crimes. Meanwhile, cops were dispatched to cover roads in and out of town with orders to be on the lookout for any suspicious characters trying to flee, and detectives fanned out looking to interview anyone who had seen any person who did not fit in or was not known in the neighborhood. Among those who spoke with the cops on this matter was Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who knew the Bordens. According to Dr. Hardy, when he rode by the house that morning shortly before 10:30, he had noticed a strange pale man on the sidewalk acting what he described as strangely. This strange pale man was seemingly never identified by the cops, but they did have a fairly specific type of person they were looking for. Namely, they were looking for anyone seen in and around the area who looked foreign. Specifically, they seemed to be looking for Portuguese immigrants. Indeed, Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid, when questioned, would say that she believed a Portuguese immigrant who worked on one of Andrew Borden's farms in Swansea had visited the house that morning. However, Lizzie would correct Bridget that the man in question was actually Swedish, and not one of the hated and feared Portuguese, whose status as the most recent immigrant arrivals and darker complexion helped to ensure they were placed on the lowest rung of the societal ladder and viewed constantly with hatred and suspicion. You see, at the top of said societal ladder were, of course, the proper native-born Yankee residents of Fall River. Several rungs below them were the Irish immigrants, and then many rungs even below the Irish were the Portuguese, who were seen as lesser and giving, among other things, an undeserved reputation for violence, in part because they were darker-skinned, which, according to racist logic, made them closer to Africans, which was seen as a bad thing. In a situation like this, then, the same racist logic also made Portuguese immigrants the most logical suspects. Indeed, a Portuguese man named Antonio was arrested in a saloon a few blocks away from the Borden home, primarily it seems for being Portuguese. This man was lucky though, as in addition to the cops having no evidence against him, he was also able to bring in a reliable character witness, so they had to let him go. Of course, Antonio would not be the only Portuguese immigrant arrested and questioned for this crime either. Indeed, there was even one man from Portugal who was accused of being seen with a bloody axe near the scene of the crime. However, the man in question was able to conclusively prove that not only had he not even been in Fall River on the day in question, but he was also able to show the cops his own axe that was sitting in his woodpile, clearly unmarred by blood. Meanwhile, yet another Portuguese man would be arrested for reportedly trying to take a significant amount of money out of the bank. Yet despite all of these arrests and questions, time and again the cops would come up empty when it came to tying any of these immigrants to the crime. This kind of racist logic, however, would also be used to discredit the police and their investigation, what with everything being handled by a primarily Irish police force and an Irish medical examiner, which was reason enough to generate mistrust among the native-born Yankee residents of Fall River and beyond. Indeed, the fact that a number of the cops involved in the case would be promoted was seen by a number of the native-born Fall River residents as these cops being rewarded by the city's Irish mayor for arresting Lizzie. Those individuals bothered by the fact that the predominantly Irish police force were investigating these high-profile murders also looked suspiciously at the fact that the Irish maid Bridget Sullivan was eliminated as a suspect by said predominantly Irish police force. However, Lizzie Borden herself would even insist that the maid, whose name she apparently couldn't even bother to remember, was innocent of this crime. In addition to Bridget, the cops also questioned Lizzie's uncle, the brother of her deceased mother, John Moores. John, prior to this, had lived out west for nearly 40 years, during which time he primarily raised cows and horses in Iowa. 3 years prior to these events, though, John had returned to Massachusetts, where he now worked as a horse trader. Then, the day prior to the murders, John had unexpectedly dropped in to visit his relatives and was welcomed with open arms by Andrew at least. His relationship with Lizzie, meanwhile, was a bit more cloudy, as by all accounts, the two would not actually see each other on this visit until after the murders, as Lizzie, when she had come home the previous night, had gone straight to her room without making any effort to greet her uncle, with some suggesting this was potentially out of resentment for her father choosing to discuss business matters with him instead of her. How much validity there is to that speculation I can't say, other than it appears to be just that speculation. Regardless, John's behavior upon returning to the Borden residence around noon on the day of the murders was seen at the very least odd, if not downright suspicious. You see, despite the numerous people crowding around the house and the cops moving all about the property, Morris seemed to not think anything was amiss. Instead, he just wandered into the backyard where he picked some pears off the ground that had fallen from the tree back there and began consuming them casually before eventually heading into the house and identifying himself to the cops. It was only at that point that he seemingly was made aware of the gruesome murders that had taken place. That being said, as odd as his behavior might have been, John was able to give a detailed account of his travels, as in addition to his niece vouching that he had visited her that morning, Morse was able to give the time, street, and number of the trolley he had ridden on his return trip. In fact, he was even able to give the number on the cap of the conductor driving said trolley, which in all is a pretty insanely detailed alibi. One that feels almost too detailed, but still it would be enough to eliminate him as a potential suspect. Meanwhile, suspecting that an axe or hatchet had to be responsible for the clearly visible wounds on Andrew's body, Officer Michael Mullally moved to the dining room where Lizzie was currently seated. After apologizing for disturbing her, Officer Mullally asked if there were any axes or hatchets in the house, to which Lizzie without apparent hesitation told him there were. She then told Bridget to show him where they were in the basement. The maid then led the officer down into the cellar where there were 2 axes and a shingle hatchet. She also produced for the officer a box containing another hatchet. Out of these 4 potential murder weapons, one of the axes and one of the hatchets appeared to have bloodstains on them, and even hair on their blades. Additionally, later that day, Assistant Marshal Fleet would arrive, and as a part of his personal investigation of the house, he came across another hatchet sitting in a box up on a shelf in the cellar. According to Fleet, the hatchet did not appear to be covered in dust like the other items found in the basement. Instead, he thought it looked like it might have been cleaned and rubbed in white ashes. However, due to the fact that it was missing its handle, he deemed this particular hatchet immaterial and put it back where he had found it. Meanwhile, the Borden family physician Dr. Bowen and Bristol County Medical Examiner William Dolan would both, upon examining the dead bodies, conclude that Abby had been killed first. However, no exact time could be determined, what with forensics still in its infancy. Indeed, from what I have read, it does not seem like even today exact times of death is something that can be reliably or exactly determined. In this case, they simply concluded that since Abby's blood had coagulated, she had to have died earlier, perhaps by much as an hour or so. A timeline that created suspicions among the police, because if Andrew had been killed first, Abby S.'s widow would have gotten a portion of his wealth, money that upon her death would have been passed on to her heirs, likely her half-sister. However, with Abby being killed first, Lizzie and Emma stood to inherit all their father's wealth, not just a reduced portion. The cops then began to focus on Lizzie as she was interviewed by at least 4 different policemen over the course of that day, and in some cases multiple times by the same cops. Cops who weren't particularly bothered by Lizzie's temperament given the circumstances. For example, Officer Philip Harrington, after interrogating Lizzie, would note how she had spoken in a particularly, quote, calm and collected manner. Indeed, according to the officer, despite 2 people who she was presumably close with being murdered in that very house, he did not notice the, quote, slightest indication of agitation, no sign of sorrow or grief, no lamentation of the heart, no comment on the horrors of the crime, and no expression of a wish that the criminal be caught. As a result of this, Harrington would later inform his superior, Marshal Hillier, quote, I do not like that girl. She does not act in a manner to suit me. Now, the cops wouldn't be the only ones who noted Lizzie's apparent calm demeanor that day. Lizzie's friend Alice Russell, who had arrived at the Borden home round about the same time that Abby's body was discovered, would note about Lizzie, quote, I never saw her in tears that morning. The cops and Alice then essentially claimed that Lizzie did not cry or seem all that upset, which for the cops in particular was suspicious. Now, I personally don't put much stock in this, as not everyone processes or grieves in the same way on the same schedule, much less chooses to do so in front of strangers. Additionally, there were reports from other individuals who saw and interacted with Lizzie that day that characterized her as actually being stunned and shaken. So the degree to which she was not upset by the murders is questionable. For example, as noted in the previous episode, the Borden's neighbor Adelaide Churchill, upon returning home from grocery shopping that day, had glanced over and noticed Lizzie standing inside the screen door leading into the yard. Adelaide then instantly noticed that Lizzie looked to be, quote, very white, leading her to ask the youngest Borden what was wrong. An account that suggests that Lizzie in that moment was exhibiting a very visible reaction to the events of that day. Similarly, Dr. Bowen, another one of the first individuals to arrive at the Borden home following the murders, who had in fact arrived more or less as Patrolman Allen was running off to inform his superiors that the incident at the Borden home wasn't a simple fight but a murder, would tell of how shaken Lizzie was. Dr. Bowen, you see, after examining Andrew's body and confirming the obvious, quickly turned his attention to Lizzie when she announced that she felt faint. Indeed, Lizzie would be aided by Adelaide Churchill and Alice Russell out of the hot kitchen and into the cooler dining room to collect herself. Meanwhile, you also have the account of a New York Times reporter who several days later would describe Lizzie and her demeanor following the funeral. The reporter would write about Lizzie, who despite rumor and myth claiming otherwise, was appropriately dressed in black mourning clothes, noting that, quote, her nerves were completely unstrung, as was shown by the trembling of her body and the manner in which she bore down on her supporter. When she reached the carriage, she fell back exhausted in the cushions. For supporters, this and similar accounts are proof that she had actually been emotionally affected by the death of her father at least, while detractors would insist that this was all an act that Lizzie put on as she knew everyone would be watching, and thus she had to put on a good show to try and get away with the murders. As for Officer Harrington's claim that Lizzie had made no showy claim of demanding the murderer be found, she and her sister the following day would actually have an announcement posted in the paper and have it reprinted daily for over a year that read, quote, $5,000 reward. The above reward will be paid to anyone who may secure the arrest and conviction of the person or persons who occasioned the death of Andrew J. Borden and his wife. I am also left to wonder if perhaps some of Lizzie's seemingly odd behavior may have been down to the fact that all these cops who were A, lower class, B, male, and C, oftentimes Irish, were actively invading not only her home but also her room time and again throughout the day. Essentially, my point is, regardless of whether she was guilty or not, I'm not sure if her behavior on this day really indicates that in one way or the other. That being said, the cops conducting the investigation definitely found Lizzie's behavior and manner suspicious, and it soon led them to focusing on her as their prime suspect. For example, Assistant Marshal John Fleet would note that when he asked Lizzie if she knew who had killed her mother or father, she replied with something along the lines of, quote, Mrs. Borden was not my mother, she was my stepmother. My mother died when I was a little girl. For the assistant marshal, this seemed like a strange time to raise that particular distinction. Fleet then interpreted this as a sign of a deep anger or even hatred that Lizzie held for her stepmother. Whether that was the case or Lizzie just for whatever reason wanted to make the situation clear, that was how the assistant marshal interpreted the comment. Meanwhile, Lizzie would also inform Fleet at Alice Russell's insistence of what she had confided in her friend the previous night about her fears that someone was after her family, which included telling him about an argument her father had with a man who came to the house 2 weeks earlier, looking to rent a store in the new building that bore his name. A tale which now had a new detail, as Lizzie further claimed that a man had visited the Borden home around 9 that morning, also looking to rent a store. She, however, could not say if this was the same individual or even what he looked like, as they had been sent away. How seriously the assistant marshal took this account or was preoccupied with Lizzie's so-called unusual behavior, I cannot say. Although, to be fair, her not openly weeping and insisting that the cops get their information right, that Abby was in fact not her mother but her stepmother, were not the only reasons why the police began to suspect her. There was, after all, the supposed letter that Lizzie kept insisting that Abby had received. A letter that kept everyone else in the home from looking for Abby and potentially finding her already dead body until Andrew was also slain. The cops could not help but note how Abby was clearly in the home and not visiting some anonymous ill individual, and how there was no sign in the house of such a letter. Indeed, no one would ever claim to have sent such a note on the day in question, all of which made Lizzie look quite suspicious. Then there was also the question of motive. While Andrew was not a popular figure by any stretch, there were still no glaringly obvious suspects who had a reason to murder him. His daughters, however, had a fairly obvious motive: his money. They, after all, were the ones who would receive a sizable fortune upon his death, thereby giving them the most obvious motive. And with Emma away on vacation and Lizzie in the house at the time of the murders, she was an obvious suspect. Lizzie, though, throughout the multiple interviews that day, repeatedly told the police that she had been in the barn at the time of her father's murder. Now, to be clear, some of the details would change and shift a bit during the various retellings, but this is Lizzie's general accounting of her activities during the time when her father Andrew was being murdered. Lizzie claimed she had gone out back into the yard, where she stopped for a few moments to retrieve a pair of pears that had fallen from the tree, hoping that perhaps they would help to settle her uneasy stomach. After grabbing the pair of pears, Lizzie then headed into the barn, looking for a piece of lead that she could use as a sinker, as she was thinking about going fishing with her friends who had recently gone on vacation and wanted her to join them. Lizzie, however, had an important church committee meeting that Sunday that she needed to attend, which was a big reason why she had not initially joined them. Indeed, up until recently, she had been undecided on joining them following the meeting, fearing that it would be pointless and silly to join her friends who had already been on vacation for a week by that point. However, her neighbor Miss Russell would encourage her to go if for no other reason than to get out of the fall river heat. Lizzie then had apparently decided to take her advice, and this was a part of her preparation. Upon searching the ground floor of the barn, though, Lizzie apparently did not find any pieces of lead she could use as a sinker, so she headed up to the second floor, which she claimed felt strangely cooler. So, upon finding what she felt was some relief up there, Lizzie lingered and ate her pears as she stared out the barn's window, claiming to have been in there for some 15 to 30 minutes. During which time she claimed to have heard nothing, not even the sound of the screen door opening and closing. Then, according to Lizzie, when she finally did exit the barn, she heard what to her sounded like a groan. It was at this point that she quickly ran into the house and found her father slain on the couch. Now, upon hearing this tale from Lizzie, Officer Medley would claim to have gone straight out to the barn. Medley then climbed up the stairs to the second level, where Lizzie had claimed to have been when her father was being murdered. As he reached the second floor, though, the officer claimed the floor itself was completely covered in hay dust in which, according to Medley, he could clearly see his own footprints in but no others, suggesting that no one had been up on the second level of the barn in some time, and most definitely not that morning. Meanwhile, down in the cellar, Officer Michael Mullally found a pail containing bloody cloths soaking in water, something which was highly suspicious. Lizzie, however, would claim that these bloody cloths had nothing to do with the murder. Instead, they were from her menstruating and had been there for 3 to 4 days, something which she had explained to Dr. Bowen, their family doctor. Bridget, though, would state that she had not noticed this pail until that day. However, in no small part due to the personal and womanly nature of this claim, not to mention Victorian standards of propriety, this would never really be looked into or used as evidence one way or the other. So we don't have a lot of information to support whether these bloody claws were connected to the murder, or simply the result of Lizzie experiencing her period or having the fleas, as she euphemistically called it. By the end of the first day of the investigation, Lizzie Borden had been questioned multiple times, while the house and surrounding property had been searched at least briefly. When they called it a night and the majority of the cops went home, Officer Joseph Hyde was assigned to watch over the house overnight. Hyde would then note that between 8:30 and 9 that evening, Lizzie and Alice Russell headed down to the cellar and Lizzie emptied something that sounded like water, before returning again 15 minutes later alone and did something over by the sink. Hyde, however, could not make out anything of what she was doing from where he was, and this was the only place in the house with a toilet, so the activity might have been completely normal and innocent. Meanwhile, the police had not been completely focused on the Borden household this first day, as a number had fanned out across the city looking for suspicious characters and coming up empty, as they seemed to almost be focused primarily on looking for Portuguese immigrants to pin this crime on. That, however, wasn't their only purpose as they roamed about Fall River that day, as some looked for evidence to support the claims that an individual had been targeting the Bordens and poisoning them. Both Abby and Andrew had been quite sick the previous day. Bridget had also thrown up that very morning, while Lizzie also attested to feeling queasy. Now, it has to be said that subsequent autopsies of Abby and Andrew would show absolutely no signs of poisoning, but not knowing that and assuming that A, the poisonings were real, and B, the person behind the poisoning was also responsible for the murders, the police began checking out drugstores in and around the city, hoping to find clues of the murderer's identity. Among those taking up this task were officers Herring and Daughtry. They visited the Smith's drugstore on South Main Street a few blocks away from the Borden house, wherein they found 3 witnesses claiming that Lizzie Borden herself just the day before had been in there looking to buy some prussic acid, an exceedingly deadly poison. According to Eli Benz, who worked as a clerk at the drugstore, Lizzie, who he originally identified as simply a well-dressed woman who he had never seen come to the shop before, had entered the store and requested 10 cents worth of prussic acid, claiming that she needed the poison to apply it to a sealskin cape to protect it from moths. Now, for those unfamiliar, who I assume is most of you as I had never heard of it either, prussic acid or hydrocyanic acid is a very dangerous and very deadly poison that was traditionally used to fumigate against insects, rats, and mice, but could be prescribed in small doses. According to Benson, he informed the woman that he would later identify as Lizzie Borden that prussic acid could only be sold with a doctor's prescription. The woman protested, claiming that she had purchased this poison previously for just this purpose with no issues, but Bence remained steadfast. Indeed, according to Bence, the compound was so dangerous the drugstore did not sell it at all. Now again, Bence would tell the officers that he had not known who this woman was, but he claimed that he would be able to identify her given the chance. One of the officers then brought Bence back to the Borden household and pointed out Lizzie to him, at which point the drugstore clerk confirmed that this was the same woman. For the police then, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Lizzie, the day before the murders, had attempted to purchase some poison before visiting her friend Alice Russell, who she then told of her fears of someone trying to murder the family. This all made sense to the cops. After all, poison was more commonly the weapon employed by female murderers, which might still be the case today, but it was definitely true of Victorian-era women. For the cops, this was proof that Lizzie had been plotting to murder her father and stepmother, and it was only upon being denied access to this more common form of womanly murder that Lizzie resorted to the more brutal and uncharacteristic method of using a hatchet. As for Lizzie, when presented with these accusations, she would claim to have never attempted to make such a purchase. Indeed, she didn't even know where the Smith's drugstore was. Plus, she insisted she had not even left the house on the day in question until that evening, when she headed over to see Alice Russell. Meanwhile, the funerals for Abby and Andrew Borden would take place 2 days after the murders on Saturday, the 6th of August. The bodies would not be buried, however, as instead the state held onto them following the service to conduct autopsies. The extent of the autopsies and the fact that they ultimately removed the heads from the corpses for further study would only be revealed during the course of the trial, and it was only after the trial that the heads would be reunited with their bodies. Regardless, that same afternoon, the police would conduct a second search of the Borden home on 2nd Street. Marshal Hilliard, Assistant Marshal Fleet, Captain Desmond of the Fall River Police, Detective Seaver of the State Police, and Medical Examiner Dr. Dolan would all be involved in the search. A search that would be observed by Borden family lawyer Andrew Jennings and took place with the complete cooperation of Lizzie and Emma Borden. A fact that, like so much in this case, can be interpreted in 2 ways. For those convinced of Lizzie's innocence, this was a sign that Lizzie had nothing to hide, and also effectively refuted the police interpretation that she had no interest in capturing the guilty party. As for those who believe that she was guilty, this is just an indication of her confidence or arrogance that she had already eliminated any evidence of her guilt or otherwise hidden it so well that the foolish lower-class, oftentimes immigrant cops would never find it. In all, this particular search took some 3.5 hours, as they started in Bridget's attic bedroom and worked their way out from there. According to the Providence Journal, quote, "Stoves, mattresses, bureau drawers, clothes, cupboards, and shelves were examined. No place big enough to conceal a weapon as large as a table knife or clothing of the dimensions of a gloved finger escaped the eye of the officers." This included a thorough examination of the closet on the second floor that contained dresses belonging to Lizzie and Emma, with the majority of the dresses belonging to Lizzie. Detective Seaver, in fact, would carefully examine each and every dress from the closet, even taking some over to the window to get a better look as he examined them for any signs of bloodstains. To be clear then, the police seemed to be pretty much fully focused on Lizzie at this point. Indeed, that very afternoon, Marshal Hilliard met with Mayor John Coughlin and medical examiner Dr. William Dolan to discuss their plans to proceed, during which time they decided the next step should be an official inquest so that Lizzie could be placed under oath to potentially get some more clarity about her activities on the morning of the murders. Following this meeting, Mayor Coughlin and Marshal Hilliard would pay another visit to the Borden residence, at which point the mayor, when addressing Lizzie, Emma, and their uncle John Morse, informed the trio that they should all stay in the house, suggesting that this was so the police could protect them from the crowd outside. Lizzie, however, for whatever reason, seemed to sense that there was something more to this request, and so she bluntly asked if someone in the house was suspected of the crime, to which the mayor responded, quote, "Well, Miss Borden, I regret to answer yes, you are suspected." A statement that would later be used during the trial to suggest that from that moment on, Lizzie was effectively under arrest, which the defense team said was important, as if that was the case, Lizzie should have been informed of her rights, including her right to stay silent and not incriminate herself, like say during a formal inquest. The lack of such a formal presentation of her rights was then used to disqualify her statements given during said inquest, statements that the police at least felt were important to their case. In this moment, though, upon being told she was a suspect, Lizzie replied that she was ready to be taken in at that moment, but the authorities declined the opportunity to put her into custody then and there. Regardless, the cops would return again to the Borden home to conduct a third search 2 days later on Monday the 8th of August. This time they started in the cellar, at which point they rediscovered the broken hatchet, and this time decided to actually bring it back to the police station along with the other potential murder weapons they had confiscated. The cops also examined the yard and the barn thoroughly. This included dismantling the woodpile and going through an old unused well, both places where objects like a murder weapon might have been hidden. This seems to have been quite the thorough search. Indeed, the cops even tore up the floorboards in the barn. Yet, in all these places, they failed to uncover anything of any particular note. And so concludes at least the initial phase of the investigation, with the cops focused almost exclusively on Lizzie Borden as their main, if not only, suspect. While the cops were conducting their investigation, in the background, a veritable newspaper war was taking place, as papers both in and around Fall River all looked to capitalize on a story that was guaranteed to capture the public's attention. I mean, the story of a brutal, bloody murder of one of the wealthiest residents of the city is a story ready-made for breathless newspaper coverage. Indeed, the very first edition of the Daily Herald that was published the following day would sell out in a matter of minutes, as it bore the headline, quote, "Shocking crime. A venerable citizen and his aged wife hacked to pieces at their home. Mr. and Mrs. Borden lose their lives at the hands of a drunken farmhand. Police searching actively for the fiendish murderer." A headline that was fairly inaccurate and wildly speculative. Not that it mattered, as this was exactly the type of story that we see time and again bringing in the readers. People wanted all the gory and salacious details of the crime and the potential motives and identity of the person behind it. The degree to which the people of Fall River were paying attention to this story was only further illustrated 2 days later during the funeral for Andrew and Abby Borden, which was held in the sitting room of the Borden home, the very same room where Andrew had been murdered, by the way. While there would be some 75 mourners inside the house taking part in the funeral services, an estimated crowd of 1,000 to 4,000 people gathered outside. Now remember, Andrew, while rich, had not been a popular or even remotely charitable figure in life. These people then were not gathering out of respect or mourning. Instead, they were likely there purely because it was an exciting and interesting story/mystery. Also fueling a fair amount of the interest and coverage was the initial fear that the culprit of this crime was some homicidal maniac who had not actually targeted either of their victims and had instead simply murdered at random, which was the greatest fear among the people of Fall River, as it meant that any one of them could be next. They, too, could be the victim of someone who killed for no reason. None of them were safe, not even in their own home. Tales of suspicious people abounded in the newspaper coverage. One farmer, for example, would recount an encounter he had in the woods near his home. It all started when he was walking through the woods thinking he was alone, when he unexpectedly heard someone say, quote, "Poor Mrs. Borden." Surprised that someone was so close by, the farmer turned to see who had spoken, at which point he noticed an unshaven man dressed in black who had bloodstains on his shirt. When the strange unshaven man noticed the farmer looking at him, he picked up a small hatchet that he shook at the farmer before jumping over a nearby wall and running away. Then there was a tale told by a pair of carpenters who claimed to have seen a short, poorly dressed, beardless man on the morning of the murders. This was notable because, according to the carpenters, this odd figure appeared to be carrying a large and unusual-looking cleaver partially concealed under his arm as he walked down the street. Meanwhile, the Fall River Herald would write on the 8th, quote, "Mrs. Chagnon and her daughter Martha say that Wednesday night about 12 o'clock, they distinctly saw a man jump over the fence into the Borden yard, and subsequently they heard a slight noise in the barn," suggesting that the night before the murder some strange man had been lurking around the Borden home and may have gained entrance to their barn. Possibly the most important of these papers, however, was the upstart Fall River Globe, a paper that, unlike many of its competitors, wasn't shy about embracing the town's working-class Irish immigrant population and challenging the old Yankee families in their grip on wealth and power in town. A paper that also very much employed the yellow journalism tactics of the day, and in doing so, quickly rose to the third highest-selling paper in the city. A paper that, given that information, you shouldn't be surprised to learn latched onto the idea that Lizzie Borden was guilty from pretty much the very beginning. Indeed, the Fall River Globe would be the first paper to shift away from focusing on her uncle John Morse as the most popular suspect to focusing on Lizzie, with pretty much all their stories from that point on being about her as the one responsible. In doing so, they weren't shy about reprinting every piece of rumor and innuendo that supported that conclusion. For example, they were all too eager to print what Hiram Harrington told one of their reporters. Hiram, you see, was Andrew Borden's brother-in-law, having married Andrew's sister. According to Hiram, there were deep divisions between the daughters and their stepmother and Andrew. Few knew of this, though, as the family had kept the issues quiet. Hiram, though, was not only aware of these divisions, but he had even heard Lizzie make many a bitter statement about her father. Claims which seem a bit odd given that Hiram was apparently not welcome around the Borden home by order of Andrew himself. Indeed, Hiram reportedly had long held a grudge against his brother-in-law for his miserly ways. Still, this did not stop the Fall River Globe from printing this story or any number of other stories focusing on Lizzie as the prime if not only suspect of the crime, with many of these stories likely coming from members of the local police department, individuals like Philip Harrington, who was one of, if not the first to start holding such suspicions. Indeed, the Globe was the first paper to publish a story about Lizzie's alleged attempt to buy prussic acid the day before the murders, as the paper scooped its competitors when it ran the headline, quote, "What did Lizzie want of poison?" And this was only the beginning, as soon the paper was calling for Lizzie's arrest and stirring up its readers at the injustice that she had not yet been put behind bars, suggesting that she was being shown favoritism as she was one of the right sort, a wealthy native-born Yankee. In other words, not like the predominantly Irish working-class readers, who feared that Lizzie, due to her wealth and the fact that she was one of the vaunted Bordens, even if her branch of the family wasn't one of the most notable, would get off because of her wealth and those connections. Something that wasn't the most unreasonable fear, as everyone knew the way Fall River ran. It was apparent to any who chose to pay attention how all the old Yankee families, the residents of the hill, the wealthy Protestants, all hung together and clutched greedily onto their power. It seemed highly unlikely then that such a group would ever allow one of their own to be brought down, regardless of what they had done. Indeed, rumor had it that the larger Borden clan was prepared to spend millions of dollars, with one reporter apparently putting the number at $15 million to ensure that Lizzie was never convicted. The fear then among Fall River's working class, especially among those who read the Globe, was that the police would not be able to overcome all these powerful connections and mete out justice. The Fall River Globe was fairly unique in this, as most of the city's other papers with their ties to the old structure of native-born Yankees tended to side with Lizzie. She was, after all, one of them. So while other papers would take shots at the Fall River police force for their admitted failings in the handling of this case, the Fall River Globe would side with the predominantly Irish police force who were coming after one of the upper crust of Fall River society. The Fall River Herald, for example, unlike the police and the Globe, would not look at Lizzie's lack of visible grieving as suspicious. Instead, they chalked it up to Yankee quote-unquote steeliness, an attribute they insisted she surely had inherited from her vaunted father. The Springfield Republican, meanwhile, would be far more critical of the Fall River police and their investigation than their competitors at the Fall River Globe, as it would write acidly, quote, "All through the investigation carried on by the Fall River police, a lack of ability has been shown seldom equaled, and the causes they assign for connecting the daughter with the murder are on par with their other exhibitions of lack for wisdom. Because someone unknown to them and too smart for them to catch butchered two people in the daytime on a principal street of the city, using brute force far in excess of that possessed by this girl, they conclude that there is probable reason to believe that she is the murderess. Because they found no one walking along the street with hands and clothes reeking with blood, they conclude that it is probable, after swinging the axe with the precision of a butcher, she washed the blood from her hands and clothes." Arguing then that it was only out of a desire to hide their own incompetence that the Fall River police had come to point the finger at Lizzie Borden. Yet, regardless of where a publication or its readers stood concerning the guilt or innocence of Lizzie Borden, the fact remained it was practically a license to print money for these various papers. This was, after all, far from the normal crime scene in Fall River, where cops mostly dealt with drunk and disorderly types of complaints. Indeed, the worst they typically had to deal with were assaults and battery. Any murder then, especially one with this level of brutality, was definitely going to stand out. Plus, on top of that was of course the social standings of the victims, which were news in and of themselves, as was the identity of the police's supposed top suspect Lizzie Borden, since the individuals typically arrested for crime in Fall River were largely male, working class, and immigrants, and Lizzie Borden was literally none of those things. Despite this and all the conspiracy theories that those in power in Fall River would never allow one like Lizzie to go down no matter her alleged crime, the case against her continued to move forward. The next step in this was a formal inquest that was held in the small district courtroom above the police station. A legal hearing overseen by the 72-year-old head of the district court, Judge Josiah Blaisdell, and the 45-year-old former state senator and representative turned district attorney Hosea Knowlton, who had served in this role for a decade by this point. There would, however, be no attorneys representing the people being questioned during this hearing, which was actually not unusual and pretty standard for inquests. As for those called to testify, they did so independently, meaning they did not testify in the presence of other witnesses. Both the Fall River Herald and the Globe, though, could not help but notice how two of the witnesses, Lizzie Borden and Bridget Sullivan, were apparently treated differently, namely in how they were brought to the police station to testify during the inquest. You see, when it came to Lizzie Borden, the police clearly hired a coach with currents to take her to and from the courtroom in private. Meanwhile, Bridget was seen walking to the station on foot, escorted by Officer Doherty. Yet, despite being an apparent stark illustration of the differences between these two women and the kind of benefits wealth brings you regardless of circumstances, the reality was, according to Bridget, she had also been offered the use of a carriage but had instead preferred to walk. Still, this served as a fine illustration of the issues underlying the case, as even the Fall River Herald would note that, quote, "A remark is going rounds that if the parties present were poor people, they would have been locked up long before now," which was probably true. Regardless, the proceedings were private, meaning the media and the hordes of interested people from in and around Fall River could not attend. However, Marshal Hilliard, Detective Seaver of the State Police, Medical Examiner Dolan, and Mayor Coughlin would all observe the inquest personally. Among those who testified during these proceedings was the aforementioned Irish maid Bridget Sullivan, who had initially, when being questioned by the police, been terrified that she was being arrested and blamed for the murders. She was seemingly quickly eliminated as a suspect, though, and was here primarily to go over what she had seen, done, and heard that morning. Basically everything I covered in the previous episode, from her getting up to making breakfast to washing the windows, before ultimately going to lay down for a few minutes, before being summoned back down as Lizzie discovered her father's body. Sarah, Abby Borden's sister, would also testify, saying as she did so that she knew of no antagonism between her older half-sister and her stepdaughters as a result of the property she resided in. This was in reference to the state's contention that the purchase of Sarah's home 5 years earlier by Andrew Borden had created such a division within the Borden family that it ultimately led to the murders of Andrew and Abby. Now, Sarah's testimony could mean multiple things. Sarah simply might not have been aware of the inner workings of the Borden family. It's quite possible her half-sister could have wanted to shield Sarah from feeling any guilt about the trouble she had as a result of trying to help her out. On the other hand, her testimony could simply mean the issues the state were so sure led to the murders were actually overblown. Granted, we know that Lizzie stopped calling Abby mother after this incident, but remember, Emma had never called Abby mother, so perhaps this was not quite the source of friction we had been led to believe. Conversely, though, it has been suggested that perhaps Sarah, in delivering this testimony, was simply looking out for her own interest, as Emma at this moment had control of her father's estate, which notably included the home that Sarah and her family lived in. Sure, Emma and Lizzie would eventually transfer all of Abby's property, including Sarah's home, to her family, but that does not necessarily mean that Sarah in this moment did not fear crossing the Borden sisters. As you can see, then, like so much else in this case, we can't really say one way or the other, as the motivations of so many remain open to speculation. Augusta Poole Tripp would also testify during the inquest. Augusta was called because she had been interviewed by the police during the investigation, at which time she reportedly mentioned a conversation she had with Lizzie, in which Lizzie had talked about not trusting her stepmother and her fear of being disinherited. On the stand, however, Mrs. Tripp did not seem to recall much from that interview with the police, and nor did she recall that specific conversation. This mostly feels like Lizzie's friends and people of her class kind of closing ranks around her. That being said, it is possible that the interrogating officer may have misinterpreted or misremembered the nature of the interview. At the very least, this again suggests a motive for the killings. However, John Morse, who had himself once been a primary suspect in this case, would testify that while Andrew seemed to have at one point had a will, he had quietly destroyed it 15 years earlier. In the event of his death, then, his property would have likely been divided up evenly between his survivors, i.e. Abby, Lizzie, and Emma, had Abby not died as well. Testimony which indicates that Lizzie should have had no reason to believe that her and or Emma would have been cut out of her father's inheritance, which of course does not mean that she could not have wrongly believed it anyway. Regardless, the most important part of this inquest that went on for 3 days was Lizzie's own testimony, with Lizzie Borden testifying on each day of the inquest for hours on end. For example, concerning her supposed motive, Lizzie would insist that her relations with her stepmother had remained, quote, quite cordial, even after the apparent uproar with Abby's half-sister's house 5 years earlier. She also, in contrast with how she had responded to Assistant Marshal Fleet, would now, when being questioned by the district attorney if she preferred if he referred to Abby as her mother or Mrs. Borden, Lizzie would reply, quote, I had assumed you call her mother. Overall, though, the inquest seems to have been a fairly combative atmosphere, as District Attorney Knowlton effectively assaulted Lizzie with a barrage of questions. Seriously, reading over bits of the transcript, it's just one question after another, as he seeks to clarify and or reinvestigate every little detail, no matter how minute, to expose contradictions and the like. It was at least somewhat effective as he kept digging into every part of Lizzie's morning on the first day. One of the notable pieces of information that Knowlton sought was where Lizzie had been when her father had come home. Like, for example, had she been upstairs potentially a room away from where her dead stepmother's body potentially lay? Encouraging Knowlton in this was the fact that Lizzie's timeline of that morning was confused. In this, she was quite unlike Bridget, whose story never really seemed to waver as to where she was and to where Lizzie was. For example, one exchange started out with Lizzie insisting that she was downstairs when her father came home, but she could not remember where Maggie was. Then, however, she recalled that the Irish maid had let him in. This then led to an exchange about whether he had forgotten his key or whether the multiple locks on the door were unbolted or not that morning, as Knowlton continued to pick at every little minute detail of the story, before eventually coming back around full circle to the question of where Lizzie had been when Andrew came home. At which point Lizzie stated that she thought she might have been in her room upstairs. Knowlton then asked again if that's where she was, to which Lizzie replied, quote, "I don't know sure, but I think I was." This kind of muddled and confused accounting of the morning was typical of Lizzie's testimony throughout the inquest. D. Knowlton did not just focus on where Lizzie had been when Andrew came home either. For example, he also spent some time on why it wasn't until after her father had been found murdered that Lizzie gave any thought of where Abby might be. This despite the fact that she had not been seen for 2 hours, and despite the last time Lizzie had supposedly seen Abby, she was going to fix pillow shams in the guest room, a job that would have only taken minutes. Lizzie, of course, in response would refer back to the note that only she seemed to know about, and even then she didn't know who had sent it and what it concerned, only being able to say, quote, "She told me she had a note somebody was sick," which only led the DA to wonder that if Lizzie believed Abby was out of the house, why then after the murder of her father did she insist that the others go to look for her, fearing that she too was dead somewhere in the house? To which Lizzie claimed she had told the others that she did not know if Mrs. Borden was in or out, thus she wanted them to go look for her in case she was actually in the home. Another bone of contention was the question of where Lizzie was when her father was being murdered, with Lizzie's story being that she had been in the barn during the time the murder had taken place, having gone out there looking for pieces of lead to use as sinkers so she could go fishing when she went to vacation with her friends in Marion. D.A. Knowlton had a hard time believing this story, as he asserted that searching through a box in the barn's loft should have only taken 3 or so minutes to accomplish, not the 15 to 20 minutes that she claimed to have been out there. Also voicing his disbelief that she would have stayed in what was presumably a stifling and hot barn loft, consuming 3 pears after she had not been interested in eating breakfast, and had, according to Lizzie herself, told Abby not to pick her up anything for dinner during her supposed trip that morning. For her part, Lizzie insisted that it took her 10 minutes to search through the box, and that she had spent some time in the barn moving boards and the like around as she conducted her search. For his part, District Attorney Knowlton did not believe any of Lizzie Borden's claims, and saw her imprecise and confused accounting of the day as proof of her guilt. Indeed, he would later call the statement she had given during the inquest as her quote-unquote confession. Lizzie and her supporters, meanwhile, would blame the conflicting and confused statements on her being under the influence. You see, Dr. Bowen on the day of the murders had given Lizzie 2 doses of bromocaffeine, a purported sedative to calm her nerves, following which over the next week he then prescribed Lizzie morphine to also calm her nerves. Specifically, the doctor prescribed a double dose of the drug before bed, which might potentially suggest that unlike the accounts of her seeming lack of grief, the doctor had actually witnessed behavior that required such a prescription. It would also notably potentially explain why some didn't feel like she was reacting as they expected, and why she seemed confused at times during the inquest as she was impaired by morphine. For example, at one point when D.A. Knowlton was pressing Lizzie on where she had been when her father had come home that morning, she exclaimed, quote, "I don't know what I have said. I have answered so many questions. I am so confused that I don't know one thing from another. I am telling you just as nearly as I know how." Also, later during the inquest when Knowlton asked, quote, "Do you desire to give me any information or not?" Lizzie would reply, quote, "I don't know it. I don't know what your name is." Responses that seemed to indicate a significant amount of confusion about issues beyond just her actions on the morning of the 4th of August. Conversely, though, those who believe in Lizzie's guilt might suggest that the doctor could have just prescribed these drugs because it's what he expected her to need, instead of prescribing them based upon his own observations. Additionally, just because he prescribed Lizzie morphine does not necessarily mean that she actually took it, and that was the reason for her confused and her conflicting answers. Instead, they insist that was all the result of her lying to cover up for the fact that she was the one who had actually committed the murders and could not actually keep her story straight. Some even argue that her statements to the police even before the morphine was prescribed weren't entirely believable or coherent, again suggesting that the real reason why her statements were confusing or even conflicting was simply due to her lying. However, you could also argue that the reason why her initial statements were a bit confused was simply the result of her reeling from her father being murdered. Indeed, at one point Knowlton would press Lizzie about finding her father's corpse, at which point he asked if she saw his face, further pressing if she had seen it covered in blood, had she seen his eyeball hanging out, and had she seen the gashes where his face was laid open. A series of questions that Lizzie responded that yes, she had seen his face covered in blood, but she had not noticed the more gruesome details, following which, according to the court stenographer, quote, "Witness covers her face with her hands for a minute or two, then the examination is resumed." An exchange that, depending upon your belief in her guilt, either illustrates that she was actually affected by the traumatic experience or was simply acting. Regardless, following the inquest, Lizzie was asked to wait in the police station, during which time District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, Marshal Hilliard, Bristol County Medical Examiner Dr. William Dolan, and Detective Seaver of the State Police all met in Marshal Hilliard's office to discuss how they should proceed, with the consensus being they should arrest Lizzie Borden. It was at this point that D.A. Knowlton learned that Marshal Hilliard, since fairly early on in the investigation, had been holding onto a warrant for Lizzie, which he had obtained on his own authority. You see, Marshal Hilliard had been so confident that Lizzie was the culprit that in his zeal to lock her up, he actually had a clerk at the 2nd District Court provide him with an arrest warrant. He was just so sure the order would come down at any moment to arrest Lizzie Borden that instead of waiting for a warrant to be drawn up and issued, he just wanted to reach into his own pocket to pull one out and make everything nice and official. Now, to be clear, this was highly questionable, as before this point, they had made no official decision to arrest and charge Lizzie, so Hilliard really had no reason to have this warrant before this very moment. As such, Knowlton would order the marshal to return the warrant he had and procure a new one. With this done, they first brought the news of the warrant and their plans to arrest Lizzie to her lawyer Andrew Jennings, who agreed to be the one to break the news to his client. Lizzie was then held overnight in the police station in the so-called matron's quarters as they waited to hold the formal arraignment in the district court the next morning. It was now just a week after the murders, and Lizzie Borden was in custody and charged with being responsible. Meanwhile, the people of Fall River were kept informed about what was happening thanks to papers like the Globe, who proclaimed, quote, "Locked up, Lizzie Borden at last in custody." With the news then out, even in the face of a heavy downpour, a sizable crowd still gathered outside the police station, while inside Lizzie entered a not guilty plea and her lawyer Andrew Jennings criticized the inquest, stating that it had biased the judge against his client, who he consistently referred to as Girl and as Miss Lizzie, both seemingly in an attempt to draw attention to the idea of her virginal innocence. As for his specific complaint, Jennings held that, quote, "It is beyond all human nature to suppose that your honor could have heard all the evidence at the inquest and not be prejudiced." This was important because Judge Josiah Blaisdell was also set to preside over the preliminary hearing, which was the next step in this legal process, with Jennings arguing, quote, "I submit that your honor is acting in a double capacity, and therefore you cannot be unbiased. This takes away from my client her constitutional right to be heard by a court of unprejudiced opinion." What Jennings wanted then was for these subsequent legal proceedings to be handled by different judges, and not the same one who had presided over the inquest that had led to Lizzie's arrest. Jennings, however, would be overruled. With these formalities handled, Lizzie was then taken 16 miles to the north to the county jail in Tanton, as they actually had facilities there to accommodate female prisoners. That being said, Lizzie was not exactly treated like all the other prisoners, thanks to her knowing the jail matron Mrs. Isabel Wright, who happened to be the mother of one of Lizzie's childhood friends. It was this connection and likely her family wealth and standing in Fall River that saw to it that Lizzie got certain benefits that others held in the jail did not. Like, for example, Lizzie at least at times was able to order her meals from a local hotel. Yet still, none of this changed the fact that the 9.5 by 7.5 foot cell that she was placed in would be her home for the next 9 months. Lizzie Borden might have been arrested and jailed on the charge of murdering her father and stepmother, But that did not mean she did not have a number of people supporting her. She was, after all, wealthy, native-born, and not only a Protestant, but a prominent and visible churchgoer as well. This all but ensured that she would be supported by the wealthy native-born Protestants of Fall River. Basically then, all the established families were behind Lizzie. She also notably had the support of Fall River Protestant leaders. This was, after all, quite the divided city, what with the incoming immigrant hordes, many of whom were coming from predominantly Catholic countries, a situation that led to figures like Reverend William W. Adams, a minister at the First Congregational Church, to look down his nose at Catholic education as he called their nuns, quote, phenomenally incompetent, because they focused more on Catholic indoctrination than on other subjects in their schools. Reverend Adams would also criticize Catholic immigrant parents for not only having little to no education themselves, but for also not appreciating the need to properly educate their children, a reference to many immigrant children not attending any schooling after a certain age as they worked in the various mills and factories around town, with the good Reverend conveniently ignoring the fact that these families often had little choice but to subject their children to working in Fall River's mills because of the situation created by the families who owned said mills, families that of course supported Adams and he supported in turn without complaint. So, with the Irish mayor and the predominantly Irish police force arresting Lizzie Borden, Reverend William W. Jubb of the Central Congregational Church, the one that Lizzie attended, rallied his flock to support one of their own, justifying his surety that Lizzie was innocent by insisting that a man clearly had to be responsible for such a brutal crime, stating that, quote, one to commit such a murder must have been without heart, without soul, a fiend incarnate, the very vilest of degraded humanity, or he must have been a maniac. None of which he declared could describe Lizzie Borden, and so he asked his parishioners to pray for the, quote, poor stricken girls, referencing Lizzie and her sister Emma. Sermons of similar themes, messages, and passions were performed in many of Fall River's Protestant churches following the murders and following Lizzie's arrest. Churches that were attended by the wealthy and prominent members of the city, people who, by the way, had more in common with the Bordens than they had in common with the people investigating and accusing her. Indeed, the Sunday after her arrest, the Central Congregational Church's Christian Endeavor Society would declare their support of Lizzie. Women's groups would also rush to support Lizzie Borden during this time. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, for example, after offering their sympathy for Lizzie's losses, would announce, quote, we would also declare our unshaken faith in her as a fellow worker and sister tenderly beloved, and would assure her of our constant prayers that she may be supported under unprecedented trials and sorrows now resting on her. Suffragists, too, would rally to support Lizzie, as in addition to reprinting the Women Christian Temperance Union's vow of support in the American Women's Suffrage Association's weekly newspaper, the Woman's Journal, the organization would also declare on the 20th of August, quote, Lizzie Borden believed innocent. On top of that, the president of the Massachusetts WCTU, Susan Fessenden, would actually visit Lizzie in her jail cell, following which, during the WCTU state meeting in Boston, Susan would take the opportunity to promote Lizzie's history of charitable and virtuous activities, drawing attention to her, quote, helpfulness in the Grand Army of Temperance Workers and her kindness to those in need of assistance. Fessenden didn't stop there either, as she also pleaded with the governor to allow Lizzie to be released on bail as her, quote, probably innocence was at least as great as that of her guilt, arguing that Lizzie's 30 years of virtuous life ought to count for something in a case filled with so much doubt and question. Then at the WCTU's annual convention, Fessenden would again bring up the issue of Lizzie Borden, most specifically the fact that she would be facing an all-male jury. In other words, not really a jury of her peers. In this, I believe, as much as anything else, you see one of the core motivations why so many suffragists rallied to Lizzie's aid. They were fighting for women's rights, not just the right to vote, but to be represented throughout the government and legal system. Indeed, Lizzie's entire fate was in the hands of men. Her trial would be presided over by male judges, while her male attorneys would defend her against the prosecutors, who were also men, and an all-male jury would be tasked with deciding her fate, all of which would be detailed and communicated to the nation by predominantly male newspaper reporters, all of which seemed quite unfair. Additionally, though, it has to be noted that while some suffragists were honestly fighting for all women, the reality was a not insignificant number were only looking to fight for women like themselves, meaning white middle to upper class native-born Victorian women, a group that Lizzie was very much a part of. For these women, they saw what was happening to Lizzie as yet another attack on the very nature of Victorian womanhood, with Lizzie, due to her activities prior to the murders and her likely carefully crafted demeanor and presentation from here on out, very much embodying what Victorian women were supposed to be. Lizzie had a reputation for being pious due to her regular and visible church attendance, as well as her work as a Sunday school teacher. This in spite of the fact that no one else in her family appeared to have been particularly religious. Lizzie had really only started embracing religion when she was 27, but once she did, she became an enthusiastic and dedicated member of the church, as not only would she take up the duties of a Sunday school teacher, but she would also become the secretary and treasurer of Christian Endeavor, a society dedicated to encouraging religion among young people. She would also become a member of the Fruit and Flower Mission, a group of women hailing from various churches in Fall River who visited sick people around town both in the hospital and in their homes, bringing with them when they did gifts for both children and adults. This group also organized Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners for poor children. Lizzie was also a member of the Women's Board of the Fall River Hospital and a member of the Young Women's Christian Temperance Union, which explains part of the reason why the WCTU was so eager to support her. Plus, to these women groups, women like Lizzie, single, highly dedicated Protestant church-going women, were exactly the type of people needed to reform American society. Women whose purity and piety were necessary to counteract the negative influences of the influx of dangerous immigrants. Lizzie then was in many ways seen as a representative of what a Victorian woman should be, with her various religious and charitable activities. By extension then, Lizzie was also seen as being quote-unquote delicate. You see, for many who supported Lizzie and insisted on her innocence, part of their argument involved the fact that women did not have the physical power, much less the temperament, to commit such a brutal and violent crime. Along a similar vein was the belief of some doctors of the age that well-to-do Victorian women who did not have to do housework because of servants, and who had either limited or even completely avoided the rigors of childbirth, were becoming overly delicate and weaker compared to their ancestors. This belief was typically used to explain why native-born Yankees were being outnumbered by immigrants, but for this specific case, this logic was being used to suggest that there was no way the, by definition, frail and delicate Lizzie Borden could have committed such a violent crime. Meanwhile, it seems that more than a few major newspapers were also on her side. Sure, the Irish working-class Fall River Globe was staunchly against Lizzie and convinced of her guilt, but the city's oldest paper, the Fall River Evening News, in contrast, was pretty firmly in Lizzie's corner. A situation that led the Fall River Globe to, even as they were celebrating Lizzie's arrest and cheering on the police, to be disturbed by the amount of support she was still getting, with one Globe headline noting, quote, "Sentimental nonsense far too prevalent." You see, the Fall River Globe could not help but note that according to their own math, quote, 3/4 of the New England papers were staring at the police and expressing a belief in the defendant's innocence. It wasn't just the New England papers that sided with Lizzie either, as the San Francisco Examiner would write that, quote, "Viewed from a distance, it would appear that the detectives had chosen to brand Lizzie as the murderer rather from lack of evidence against anyone else than by reason of evidence against her." Other papers, meanwhile, would deride the secretive inquiry that led to Lizzie's arrest as a Star Chamber examination, with Star Chamber being a reference to an Old English court long since abolished. A Star Chamber was a court overseen by members of the Royal Privy Council, and thus did not involve a jury or any other basic safeguards for the accused. The New York Telegram, for example, would write that the, quote, "tenderly bred young lady" had been arrested due to an inquiry that had, quote, "too much in nature of the Star Chamber proceedings." Now, to be clear, there was nothing unusual about the inquiry. That was simply how they had always operated. But for many unfamiliar with the procedures, they saw what happened as both being too secretive and lacking in protections for the accused. Namely, Lizzie didn't even have a lawyer present when she was being questioned. These papers also had a tendency to refer to Lizzie as the, quote, "girl," or as the, quote, "young Christian woman," both of which were used to imply her innocent and delicate nature. For these papers, the suggestion was this bloody, violent crime could not have been committed by a woman. Instead, it had to be the work of a large and powerful man. A large and powerful man who, in the eyes of the Yankees creating this narrative, was also likely an immigrant. It was in this larger environment that reporter Mrs. Kate Swan McGurk strode into with an exclusive interview. An interview that she was able to obtain as she had actually met Lizzie several years earlier when the two worked together in the Fruit and Flower Mission and several other charitable organizations in Fall River, with Kate making sure to remind Lizzie of this old association when she approached her asking if she might interview for the New York Recorder. This exclusive interview from the Tanton jail would then receive extensive circulation, as papers all across the country willingly paid to bring this information to their eager and interested readers. As she got started, Kate made sure to mention the charitable work that Lizzie had participated in as she wrote, quote, "I was anxious to see if this girl with whom I associate several years ago in the work of the Fall River Fruit and Flower Mission had changed her character and become a monster since the days when she used to load up the plates of the vigorous young newsboys and poor children at the annual turkey dinner provided during the holidays for them and take delight in their healthy appetites. I sought her in the Taunton jail and found her unchanged, except that she showed traces of the great trial she had been put through." This interview then was very much about giving Lizzie's side of the story, a side that did not depict her as a murderous monster, but as yet another victim in this cruel tragedy, with Kate sharing Lizzie's statement, quote, "I know I am innocent, and I have made up my mind that no matter what happens, I will try to bear up bravely and make the best of it. There is one thing that hurts me very much. They say I don't show my grief. Certainly I don't in public. I never did reveal my feelings, and I can't change my nature now." As a result of these various campaigns and supportive coverage, the police regularly began receiving petitions demanding they release Lizzie until her trial. That being said, though, not everyone was on Lizzie's side. You see, while native-born Yankees of her class rallied to support Lizzie and her innocence, the poorer working-class immigrants in Fall River were far less sympathetic and far more convinced that Lizzie was guilty. A faction which is clearly illustrated by the Globe's response to the McGurk interview as they wrote, quote, "The flapdoodle gush, idiotic drivel, misrepresentations, and in some instances anarchic nonsense, which is being promulgated by women newspaper correspondents, WCTU conventions, and other female agencies in connection with the Borden murders just now, may originate in good intentions, but do not strengthen Lizzie Borden's case much in the opinion of the public. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts will, for the present, adhere to the forms of law in conducting its criminal cases, regardless of the clamor or criticism of any petticoat propaganda." It also didn't help Lizzie's case among the Irish working-class community when some of her supporters, like the president of the Board of Aldermen, John Betty, said things like, quote, "We hate to believe, we find it hard to think, that a girl brought up as well and with the intellectual association she has had would commit such a crime as this. I have always wondered why the servant girl was not arrested." As, unsurprisingly, targeting the Irish servant Bridget Sullivan did not earn Mr. Beatty any popularity points among the local Irish population. Indeed, for a fair number of Lizzie's opponents, largely those not of the wealthy old Protestant stock, the downfall of Abe Borden was a bit of schadenfreude. Finally, one of the old wealthy and powerful families were being taken down a notch. At last then, here was proof that perhaps they could not in fact get away with anything. With the city thus divided, the preliminary hearing was set to take place on the 22nd of August, with Judge Blaisdell once again presiding. The most notable thing about this step in the legal process, however, was the fact that unlike the inquest, the preliminary hearing was open to the public. Crowds then gathered outside the police station where the district courtroom was, as they all hoped to get inside and get a front row seat for this real-life drama. There were so many people, of course, that not all could actually get in. Among those lucky enough to get a seat, women tended to outnumber the men. Meanwhile, the hearing was also well attended by reporters, as the Fall River Herald would point out, quote, "There are 43 reporters and sketchers inside the rail at the district court, representing all the leading dailies of the East," making sure to add, quote, "Among them are 6 or more ladies." In all, this preliminary hearing would last for 6 days as 23 people testified, with the purpose of this proceeding being to determine if the state had sufficient evidence against Lizzie to present the case to the grand jury in November, with the goal specifically being convincing the judge of Lizzie's probable guilt. The judge in question notably being the same one who had overseen the initial inquest that saw Lizzie being arrested in the first place. Unlike the inquest, however, Lizzie was allowed legal counsel. She would be represented by Andrew Jennings, who had served her family for some time in that role. Jennings, though, would not be alone, as he would be aided by Melvin Adams, a graduate of the Boston University Law School. Adams had, over the years, worked as both a criminal defense lawyer and an assistant district attorney in Suffolk County, meaning he was quite experienced working on both sides of the aisle. Adams then had a well-earned reputation as one of the most skilled criminal attorneys in the state. Now, while on one hand it seemed a bit unfair for the same judge who presided over the inquiry to also be the deciding voice in this preliminary trial, this process would give the defense team a good look at the prosecution's playbook, as they would present essentially the same case during these preliminary proceedings as they would during the actual trial. That's not to say, however, that the defense just sat back and let the prosecution's claims go unchallenged. For example, they repeatedly challenged the prosecution's claims that Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid the day before the murders. The prosecution, you see, had 3 witnesses from the Smith's drugstore prepared to testify that Lizzie Borden the day before the murders had attempted to purchase the exceedingly dangerous and highly deadly prussic acid. Up first was Eli Bentz, the drugstore clerk who had dealt with the woman in question. Now, Eli had not recognized the woman who attempted to make this purchase as Lizzie Borden until being questioned by the police and being brought to her home and being shown her after the murders, which, is not how identifications are supposed to be done. Regardless, Bentz would claim he recognized her based upon her voice, which he described as being tremulous. Under cross-examination, Lizzie's lawyer questioned the clerk about the color of the dress the woman had been wearing, to which Eli said she had been wearing a dark dress, but beyond that he could not specify what the color had been. Nor could he say whether it had been uniform in color, if she had been wearing gloves, a hat, or a bonnet, or if said adornment had any kind of decorations like feathers. Additionally, the defense also had Bentz admit that he dealt with some 100 or so customers on a daily basis, with the contention being that his inability to remember specific details about the woman's outfit and the general influx of customers making it likely that he had mistakenly identified Lizzie as the woman who had attempted to buy the prussic acid. Also testifying to this attempt to purchase poison was medical student Frank H. Kilroy, who had been in the store talking with Bentz when the woman he identified as Lizzie came in. Kilroy would claim he knew her on sight, not because he knew Lizzie personally, mind you, but because he had seen her around town. Notably though, when Kilroy was cross-examined, he stated he would not describe her voice as being tremulous, which again was how Bentz claimed he had identified Lizzie. Frederick Hart was also working in the Smith's drugstore when the woman identified as Lizzie Borden entered and made a request for prussic acid from Bentz. Again, though, under cross-examination, Hart would admit that he had not in fact identified Lizzie on sight, and had only identified her when he had guided to where Lizzie was seated in the station house on the day of the inquest, which, once again, is not how you're supposed to do identifications. There's, after all, a reason why lineups are a thing, which is not to say they can't be flawed, but the idea is to see if a witness can identify a suspect without being prompted. Simply being shown a woman and being asked if this was her then just kinda taints the whole process. Meanwhile, Phoebe Bowen, the wife of Dr. Bowen, would testify that she had visited Andrew and Abby the day before the murder, the day in which Lizzie had supposedly attempted to buy the poison to murder them with. However, according to Phoebe, both Andrew and Abby had told her that Lizzie had not left the house that day, thereby making it hard for her to be down in the Smith's drugstore attempting to buy the poison. Now, of course, this was not the only evidence against Lizzie. It's just that I have already more or less laid out the state's case against her throughout the course of these episodes, and will do so again to some degree in the next, so I don't really see the need to do it again right now. It was then due to this information that was presented to Judge Blaisdell for the second time that led him to declare, quote, "Supposing for a single moment that instead of a woman the defendant was a man, and he was found close by that guest chamber which to Mrs. Borden was the chamber of death, then suppose that he was the last to see Mr. Borden alive, and the first to find his body, and that the only account he could give of himself was the unreasonable account that during the time of the murder he was out in the barn looking for sinkers. Would there be any question in mind as to what should be done with such a one found under such circumstances and environment?" For Blaisdell, the answer to this question was clear, therefore, quote, "There is only one thing to be done, however painful it may be. In the judgment of the court, the defendant is probably guilty." The case against Lizzie then would continue to move forward to be presented to the grand jury in November. That being said, the biggest piece of news to come out of these proceedings actually came from before the hearing even took place. You see, Hannah Reagan was the police station's matron, which is apparently a woman hired by the cops to deal with women prisoners and the like. Well, apparently during one of Lizzie's visits to the station, Matron Reagan left Emma and Lizzie alone in the matron's room. As she did, she went to go clean up an adjacent room, which allowed the police matron to overhear an apparent argument between Emma and Lizzie. An argument that, according to the Fall River Globe who broke the story, Reagan overheard Lizzie accusing her sister of quote-unquote giving her away, with Lizzie promising, quote, "I won't give in 1 inch." An account that seemed to suggest that at the very least Lizzie had something to hide. As such, a number of other papers picked up and ran the story as well. In response, Lizzie's lawyer Andrew Jennings, banker Charles Holmes, and Reverend Buck, among others, went to the police station following the publishing of this story to speak with Matron Reagan in an apparent effort to have her recant the story. In the face of this pressure, the matron apparently admitted that the story was not true. Now, whether that meant it was completely false or just kind of technically not true in that the exchange wasn't word for word exact, but the spirit was still generally accurate is not known. Lizzie's supporters, though, would have a statement written up for Matron Hannah Reagan to sign, a statement that asserted that not only was the story about the argument false, but that she had never heard anything resembling a quarrel between the two sisters. Before signing this statement, though, the matron apparently wanted to speak with Marshall Hilliard, who, upon being informed of the situation, told Reagan that she would be signing the document without his consent, which effectively put an end to this attempt. It would, however, lead Lizzie's supporters to claim that the matron had wanted to sign the document stating that the argument was false, but had been prevented from doing so by the marshal. As a result, even without the document, Lizzie's supporters would manage to undermine this account, effectively suggesting while doing so that it was the work of the biased Irish immigrant police department who had used the Irish immigrant matron to spread their false story to the Irish immigrant newspaper, the Fall River Globe. The dual ideas of police incompetence and newspapers publishing demonstrably false stories in an effort to slander Lizzie Borden would only be reinforced shortly before the grand jury was scheduled to consider the case. This whole disreputable chapter of the story centers around a self-proclaimed private detective named Edwin McHenry. McHenry, you see, had a history of offering his supposed investigative skills to small-town police departments lacking in formal detectives. Now, how exactly he managed to talk himself into getting hired by the Fall River Police and in what capacity is unknown, but he would definitely be hired by Marshall Hilliard. During his time working with the Fall River Police, McHenry made a little over $100. The private detective, though, saw in the Borden case a chance to make far more money than that. All he had to do was use his former insider status to offer Boston Globe reporter Henry G. Trickey the inside scoop on all the evidence and sordid details the police had collected in their case against Lizzie Borden, information that he would only divulge in return for a $1,000 bribe. For his part, the unfortunately named Trickey thought he didn't really have a choice, given the competitive environment all the papers and reporters covering the story found themselves in. As a result, the 24-year-old reporter, terrified of getting scooped by their rival paper, the Boston Herald, agreed to McHenry's asking price, giving him at first the $30 he had on him and eventually paying him at least another $400, which feels at least somewhat understandable. The part where Trickey and his bosses at the Boston Globe really slipped up, though, was when they never bothered to try and confirm any of the information the quote-unquote private detective supplied them with, and instead just printed his claims under the headline, quote, "Lizzie Borden's secret. Mr. Borden discovered it and hot words followed. Startling testimony of 25 new witnesses. Emma was kicked during that quarrel. Family discord and murder." Basically, McHenry's story was the police had hired him, and he had more or less uncovered the truth of the case by finding a glut of new witnesses, 25 to be exact. Witnesses whose combined testimony provided incontrovertible proof of Lizzie's guilt. According to the story appearing in the pages of the Boston Globe as told from the point of view of 25 witnesses, complete with their names and addresses, Lizzie, it turns out, was pregnant, a situation which deeply upset her father, as it had happened clearly out of wedlock. Now, Lizzie apparently offered to marry the man in question, but even this did not seem to satisfy Andrew, who reportedly told his guests the night before the murders after they overheard the argument between him and Lizzie that he would rather see her dead than have this shame exposed to the world. Andrew would then further elaborate that while he did not know the identity of the man responsible for this outrage, he had his suspicions. Whoever this mysterious man was, as Andrew never named him, he swore to never recognize him, a threat suggesting that no matter what happened, he would never be welcomed into the family or made eligible to inherit his fortune. A threat that potentially also meant preventing Lizzie from inheriting as well. Indeed, according to at least one of these new witnesses, Andrew had a new will written up in which he disinherited Lizzie. Meanwhile, another one of these new witnesses had on the morning of the murders witnessed a woman in the window of the upstairs guest room wearing some kind of rubber cap/hood. A detail which would explain how Lizzie, despite having committed the murders that should have left her and her clothes sprayed with blood, was seen by multiple people over the course of the day who did not notice even a drop of blood on her anywhere. These explosive revelations would not only be printed in the pages of the Boston Globe, but would be picked up by other papers like the Fall River Globe and the New York Times. Yet, even as this news was breaking and the Boston Globe was reveling in their scoop, warning signs were starting to roll in. To start with, Inspector Harrington immediately sent a telegram to the Boston Globe telling the paper that their blockbuster story was a complete falsehood. Meanwhile, it seems that a number of the individuals identified as these new crucial witnesses did not even exist, and those who did actually exist would report that they had never been questioned by the cops or by the supposed private detective, and they certainly had never given any statements matching those printed in the paper. Additionally, Dr. Bowen, Lizzie's doctor, also contacted the paper telling them that Lizzie had no quote-unquote secret, meaning she was not pregnant. With all of this information coming in, the editors of the Boston Globe very quickly realized something was very wrong. So wrong that the following morning, the latest edition of the Boston Globe included a note stating that the story from the previous day had been, quote, proven wrong in some particulars. In doing so, they kind of pointed the finger at McHenry, although they would give him the opportunity to defend himself and the contents of the story he had sold them. McHenry then tried to save face by claiming that the names of the witnesses had of course been changed to protect their identities, thereby explaining why a number of them did not seem to actually exist. However, by that evening's edition, the editors of the Boston Globe had no choice, thanks to the threat of a libel suit, but to admit that they had been tricked by a, quote, remarkably ingenious and cuttingly contrived story. In doing so, they also had little choice but to offer Lizzie Borden an apology, specifically for defaming her womanly virtue, as they wrote, quote, the Globe, being thus misled, has innocently added to the terrible burdens of Miss Lizzie Borden. So far as lies in our power to repair a wrong, we are anxious to do so, and hereby tender her our heartfelt apology for the inhuman reflection upon her honor as a woman, and for any injustice the publication of Monday inflicted upon her. Thanks to this colossal and exceedingly public misstep, the Boston Globe, New England's largest newspaper, from then on generally presented fairly sympathetic coverage of Lizzie. Yet, while in the view of the public at least, the police and their case against Lizzie took a bit of a serious black eye from this story, they would deliver a blow of their own during the grand jury proceedings. A blow that would come from an unexpected source. You see, the majority of Lizzie's friends seemed to support her. Indeed, when a reporter interviewed the individuals that Lizzie had been planning to join on vacation after her church meeting, they confirmed Lizzie's apparent intentions to join them and their plans to go fishing together, which seemingly justified her search of the barn that she claimed to have undertaken when her father was being killed. These individuals, among whom were Anne and Mary Holmes, Elizabeth Johnson, and Isabel Fraser, would issue a joint statement to the reporter in which they declared that, quote, the very idea of her killing Mr. and Mrs. Borden is preposterous. Granted, they admitted that, quote, her stepmother and she were not fond of each other, a state of affairs that, as everybody knows, is not uncommon between second wives and grown-up daughters. As such, they did not view these issues as a convincing motive for murder. More important, though, was the relationship between Lizzie and Andrew, to which her friend stated, quote, as for Lizzie and her father, they were, without being demonstrative, very fond of each other, meaning that even if they weren't showy in their affection, they were still very close. Notably, though, not all of her friends were so convinced of her innocence, with one's doubts proving to be crucial in the progress of the case against Lizzie. You see, when the case was initially presented to the grand jury, they did not actually seem all that inclined to indict Lizzie for the murders, as illustrated by the fact that the grand jury was supposed to hand down their indictments on the 21st of November, yet any action on the Borden case specifically was delayed until the 1st of the following month. Indeed, newspapers would report this delay was due to the grand jury not being convinced by the state's case. It's at this point that Lizzie's friend, one of the first people she summoned to her side after finding her father murdered, Alice Russell, re-enters our story. Alice had actually stayed with Lizzie and Emma in the Borden home in the days following the murders. Now, throughout this time, it did not seem like Alice harbored any doubts until things took a turn on the Monday after the murders, a time after multiple searches had been conducted of the home and after the mayor had informed Lizzie that she was a suspect. On this morning in question, after having breakfast, Alice had left Emma and Lizzie in the kitchen and headed upstairs. When Alice returned, she was surprised to find Lizzie pulling a dress out of one of the kitchen cabinets. As she walked in, she heard Emma ask Lizzie what she was planning, to which Lizzie responded something along the lines of, quote, "I am going to burn this old thing up. It's covered with paint." Following which, Alice saw Lizzie tearing up the skirt and feeding it into the fire in the kitchen stove. Now, she apparently made no effort to stop Lizzie in that moment, but Alice would later grow increasingly nervous about this incident she had witnessed, as when being questioned by the police about Lizzie's dresses, she had not disclosed this incident. Feeling like she had lied, she confided this information to the sisters, telling them, quote, "The worst thing you could have done was burn that dress. I have been asked about your dresses." To which, according to Alice, Lizzie responded, quote, "Oh, what made you let me do it? Why didn't you tell me?" Now, in both the inquest and the preliminary hearing, Alice had testified, but had not said anything about the dress-burning incident. The same was true for the grand jury hearings, but following this latest proceeding, Alice's conscience started to bother her too much. As she struggled with insomnia due to this sense of guilt, Alice consulted with a lawyer and was thus compelled to share with the authorities what she had seen, and in doing so, she agreed to be a witness for the prosecution. Alice's information about the dress-burning incident then seems to have been critical in getting the grand jury to agree to move the case onto trial, as following Alice's meeting with Knowlton, the DA called the grand jury back into session to present to them this new information. Now, the jury had seemingly been previously unwilling to indict Lizzie Borden, suggesting that less than 12 of the 21-member grand jury were in agreement to proceed. But on the 1st of December, following Alice's testimony, the grand jury now voted 20-1 to indict Lizzie on 3 charges of murder. 1 charge for the murder of Andrew, 1 for the murder of Abby, and 1 for the murder of both. Not sure how that works. And with that, Lizzie was officially indicted for the murders of her father and stepmother. She would now be put on trial for this most terrible crime in what was deemed the trial of the century by the press. That trial, however, was still somehow months away, meaning Lizzie Borden would spend more than a few more months locked away in prison waiting to discover her fate. While for us the distance isn't quite so long, our coverage of that trial, the revelations it brought, and a consideration of a number of the theories about this case will have to, for now, remain a story for another time. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you would like ad-free and early episodes, I set up such a feed over at patreon.com/distortedhistory. By paying $10 a month, you will gain access to the special ad-free feed available on Spotify or likely through your podcast app as long as it uses an RSS feed. I will continue to post sources on Ko-fi and Twitter though, as it's just a convenient place to go to access that information. Regardless, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.